Western media is in a frenzy. Putin wants war without end. Headlines, talk shows, politicians, all in unison. But what if that is precisely part of the staging? In recent days, RD, ZDF, and CNN have been sending images from Kupiansk and Kherson almost every minute. Destroyed houses, injured children, the chaos of war. Yet a crucial truth remains outside. In the Kremlin, there are voices that have been warning against this war for years. Dmitry Kozak, Putin's closest companion since the 90s, is said to have repeatedly said, "Don't go down this path. Ukraine will fight. Europe will break." But not a word about it in the West. Instead, the same old story. Putin as a bloodthirsty dictator, Russia as an unbridled aggressor. The reality is more complex. Yes, the fighting is raging, but at the same time, cracks are appearing in the Kremlin. Doubts, calls for negotiation. Why do we hear so little about it? Because it would disrupt the grand narrative. But this is where the real story begins, and it could change everything. Putin's closest confidant steps down, and hardly any media reports on it. Dmitry Kak, a man who accompanied Putin since the 90s, who organized the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, and was considered one of the most powerful figures in the Kremlin, has resigned. Officially, it's called resignation, but analysts from Washington and even Russian insiders speak of something quite different. Putin is said to have shown him the door. Why? Because Kozak did what has long been considered treason in the Kremlin. He spoke of peace. Already at the beginning of the war, he warned that an attack on Ukraine would not be decided in days or weeks, but could plunge Europe into chaos. He is said to have told Putin that the Ukrainians would fight and the economic costs would be catastrophic, but Putin did not listen. Nevertheless, Kok remained in the system for a long time. A relic of the old Putin era from St. Petersburg, someone who had direct access and repeatedly spoke up, calling for negotiations with Kiev, warning of endless escalation, even speaking of a urgently needed reform of the Russian justice system. But patience in the Kremlin is running out. In a time when harshness is considered the only language, a man who preaches compromise is dangerous. Kak lost the power struggle against those who demand victory at any cost. The silence of Western media on this is telling, because this story would not fit the narrative that has been spread for years. Putin as an all-powerful warmonger who tolerates no other voice in his environment. But what if the opposite is true? If there has long been a wing in the Kremlin that wants peace, which the public never gets to see? Kozak's departure shows two things. Firstly, that there are power struggles in Russia that are not intended to be visible to the outside world. Secondly, that the West does not want to use these cracks because they would disrupt the image of eternal war. Whoever calls for peace is silenced, in Moscow by dismissal, in the West by silence. But what does that mean for us? If even Putin's inner circles are looking for ways out, then the question is no longer whether there are forces for peace, but whether they ever have a chance. And this is where the real drama begins. Is Kozak's withdrawal proof that peace is still possible, or that it has been buried for good? 700,000 soldiers in the war zone. With this number, Putin himself startled even the harshest critics in the West. For ARD, or CNN and Spiegel, it was the perfect lead story. A president who counts his troops like a warlord while the world holds its breath. But what is really behind it? Is it proof of a never-ending war, or the exact opposite, an attempt to finally end the escalation by increasing the pressure immeasurably? The fact is, Putin mentioned the number at a meeting with the leaders of the Duma factions. He emphasized that Russia controls about a fifth of Ukraine, 20% of a sovereign state. A shock, yes, but those who listen closely recognize the subtext. It was not a victory pose, but a message to the inside, because at the same time, Moscow is discussing tax increases, an increase in VAT from 20 to 22%. So the Russian budget is strained, social spending is swallowing billions, inflation is gnawing at the daily lives of citizens. If a president still speaks openly about numbers, then he wants to show one thing above all: we will persevere, no matter what it costs. But the Western interpretation is different. Headlines like Putin's army is growing endlessly, or Russia is mobilizing for total war, flood the news feeds. That it is in truth also a signal to its own population. We have enough strength. Hold on, it will be over soon. This is kept silent because it would not fit the picture. The logic behind the enormous number is brutal, but simple. The more soldiers Russia puts in position, the greater the pressure on Kiev and its supporters to eventually return to the negotiating table. For Putin, it is an attempt to force peace with a threat. Peace in the Russian way, certainly, but peace instead of an endless war of attrition. But that is exactly what the West is concealing, and here lies the bitter truth. While the Russian population is already feeling how much tighter the belt is being tightened, from rising prices to additional taxes, while even figures like Kok in the Kremlin are advocating for an exit, Western media are relentlessly drumming up Putin's insatiable hunger for war. The fact that Moscow has long been reaching its economic limits and wants to end the conflict if the conditions are right does not fit into the desired dramaturgy. The 700,000 soldiers are therefore not just soldiers. They are a message, a means of pressure to the outside world, a sedative to the inside. But they are also a risk, because the larger the number, the greater the danger that the spiral will get out of control. What if Kiev refuses to be intimidated? What if Washington continues to send billions and Brussels wants to use Putin's frozen billions as a weapon against him? Then the number, which is actually intended to force peace, could become a symbol of the opposite, a war that no one can let go of anymore. And here the crucial question arises: will this enormous threat ultimately actually open doors or burn all bridges for good? Kupiansk, a city that before the war was an inconspicuous transport hub in eastern Ukraine. Today it is a symbol of total chaos. Anyone who looks at the reports from the region comes across images that can hardly be classified. Smoke over the roofs, shots in the streets, children cowering in cellars, while outside a war is raging that no longer knows any rules. 20,000 civilians are still said to live in the city, people who are trapped between the front lines every day and do not know who they can trust. Because here the line between soldier and civilian is blurred. Russian troops, according to bloggers like Deep State or eyewitnesses on the ground, are putting on civilian clothes to advance into the city unnoticed. Ukrainian fighters, according to Moscow, are said to be doing the same. The consequence: no one knows anymore who is who, and therefore every movement is a risk. Everything that moves is shot at. That's how one observer put it. And that is exactly what describes the brutal reality. The Geneva Convention, the foundation of international humanitarian law, clearly stipulates that combatants must wear uniforms to protect the civilian population. But in Kupiansk, this principle seems worthless. When soldiers fight in jeans and t-shirts, when rifles are hidden under jackets, then there is no clear line anymore. Every civilian can suddenly be considered a soldier, and every soldier can walk through the streets as an innocent passerby. A nightmare that is repeated daily. It becomes particularly dramatic when you look at the personal stories. In Kherson, a few hundred kilometers away, a Russian glide bomb recently hit a residential area. 4 injured, including a 3-year-old girl. Her face, marked by shrapnel, was shared on social networks and immediately used as proof of Russia's brutality. But who speaks about the civilians in Kupiansk who are caught in the crossfire from both sides because no one knows whether they are friend or foe? Western media have quickly found their narrative. Russian soldiers abuse civilian clothes, period. But the fact that Ukrainian units also resort to this trick in need is usually unmentioned, because it would destroy the moral black and white painting. In truth, it has become a game without rules, and the sufferers are those who should actually be protected, the ordinary people. And this is where the double standards are revealed. While war crimes by Russia are debated in talk shows in Berlin or London, hardly anything is heard about the fact that the Ukrainian side is also crossing boundaries. It doesn't fit the picture. Instead, images of destroyed railway tracks and broken power poles are shown, without mentioning that the same tricks also occur on the Ukrainian side. For the people in Kupiansk, that makes no difference. They only know that they fight for survival every day, that every trip to the market, every ride on a bicycle can end deadly, and there is an invisible enemy disguised as a neighbor, as a relative, as a friend. In this climate of mistrust, the social fabric breaks down. Kupiansk is more than a battlefield. It is a symbol of how a war erases the basic rules of human coexistence, and that is exactly why many media conceal the whole truth. Because if it became visible that both sides use these methods, then one would have to admit that this is not a fight of good against evil, but a conflict that has long lost all moral basis. The crucial question is, what remains when no one knows who the enemy is? When every door, every face, every movement becomes a risk? In Kupiansk we see the answer, and it is darker than any headline in the Western media would ever admit. Trump nods, Charles warns, and Europe hesitates. The picture of the state banquet in Windsor went around the world. King Charles II. He raises his glass, reminds Donald Trump of the duty to support Ukraine. Trump nods politely, but anyone who knows him knows that this nod was not a promise, but a tactical smile, because in interviews and at campaign events, he had long made it clear that he does not believe in endless billions of payments to Kiev. Why should we waste our money on a war that cannot be won anyway? A sentence that sounds like common sense to many Americans, but like an affront to the European elites. And here lies the drama. While the bombs are falling in Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, the West is falling apart. Some, above all Charles and large parts of the EU, are preaching perseverance slogans. We must stand firm, no matter what it costs. The others, Trump, parts of the Republicans in the USA, but also governments in Eastern Europe such as in Hungary or Slovakia, have long been asking how much longer and at what price. The European Union is simultaneously grappling with another question, the 170 billion euros of frozen Russian assets. Brussels wants to use the money to grant loans to Ukraine. But what sounds like a simple solution is in truth a legal and political time bomb, because Russia has threatened unequivocally. Whoever touches this money becomes an enemy and must expect retaliation. Moscow is already confiscating Western corporate assets in its own country, and the message is clear. You take ours, we take yours. So there is a double game going on in the background. In London and Brussels, the picture is painted of the heroic West standing by Ukraine's side. But behind the scenes, there is fear. What if Trump actually moves back into the White House? What if the USA turns off the money tap? Can Europe pay the bill alone? Many finance ministers in Copenhagen, where this very topic was discussed, secretly doubted it, but hardly anyone was willing to say it publicly. The Western media prefer to show the state banquet, the king's toast, Trump's polite gesture, a symbolic picture, but just a picture. The reality, the West is deeply divided between a president who sees Putin more as a deal partner and a monarchy that tries to raise the moral finger, between an EU that is desperately looking for sources of money and citizens who have long been asking why they should endure higher energy prices and inflation for a war that does not end. And this is where the question arises that no one in Brussels is saying out loud. What if Trump is right? What if the West is actually financing a war that is militarily hardly winnable? And what if that is exactly why Moscow has chosen its strategy? Hold out, increase pressure until the other side is tired. While Charles is solemnly appealing and Brussels is feverishly debating frozen billions, doubt is growing. In Washington, in Bratislava, in Budapest, and also in more and more living rooms in Germany. Because people have long felt that this war is not only being fought on the front lines, but in their wallets, on their electricity bills, at the gas pumps. Thus the scene from Windsor becomes a symbol, a king who warns, a Trump who smiles, and an EU that hesitates. Between moral claim and political reality, between phrases and economic hardship. But what does this rift in the West mean for Ukraine, and above all for peace? The answer to this could change the power structure in Europe forever. Donbas, a name that has long become synonymous with endless war. Anyone who reports from there today no longer speaks of rapid offensives or clear victories, but of a war of attrition, a war of attrition that claims new victims every day without the front lines shifting decisively. Attrition, a cold word, but it describes the reality in eastern Ukraine better than any other. In Pokrovsk, a city with formerly 100,000 inhabitants, the fighting is now in the middle of the center. Streets that used to be full of people, shops, and children are now only ruins. Ukrainian units are desperately trying to hold the city, while Russian troops are advancing with artillery and drones. Every block of houses becomes a battlefield. Every stairwell becomes a defensive post. Sky News reported that it is hardly possible to secure the city permanently. The Russian superiority is pushing relentlessly. A little further north in Dobropilya, the picture looks different. Here, Ukrainian counter-offensives start, falter the Russian lines, push them back, at least temporarily. It's like a pendulum. Sometimes the Russians have the upper hand, sometimes the Ukrainians, but neither manages the decisive breakthrough. Even further north, in Yampil, the Russians are launching massive attacks. The city itself is small, but strategically important. Whoever controls why has a key to the supply routes, and so this place is also drawn into the war with full force. And then there is Kupiansk in the Kharkiv province, a traffic hub that has been bitterly fought over for months. Here comes the perhaps darkest chapter. Soldiers on both sides put on civilian clothes to gain advantages in house-to-house fighting. A clear violation of international law, a betrayal of all the rules that should actually guarantee the protection of civilians. And the consequence? Pure chaos. Everything that moves is shot at, eyewitnesses report. Anyone who moves lives dangerously, whether soldier or civilian. But while the cities are burning, Moscow is sending a clear signal to the world. Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov remains in office. At 70 years old, actually ready for retirement, Putin extends his term of office by another 5 years. Many in Russia criticize him for too few successes, too many mistakes. But Putin sticks to him. Why? Because Gerasimov is a symbol that Russia does not want to break off the war, but wants to endure it to the end. And that is exactly the message. While Western experts speak of Putin's weakness, the extension of Gerasimov's term of office suggests the opposite. It is a signal of hardness. We don't give in. We'll pull it through, no matter how long it takes. For Moscow, it is less a question of short-term success than of perseverance. But what does that mean for Ukraine and for Europe? If both sides are trapped in an attrition, it is not the number of tanks or drones that decides, but the question of who can last longer. Russia relies on its sheer mass of soldiers and resources, Ukraine on Western aid, and the indomitable will of its population. But in truth, both are losing entire cities, hundreds of thousands of lives, an entire region. The Donbas is today a symbol of what this war really is. No blitzkrieg, no brief exchange of blows, but a grueling marathon. And that is exactly what makes it so dangerous, not only for Ukraine, but for all of Europe. Because the longer it lasts, the greater the danger that it will get out of control, draw in new countries, open new fronts. The crucial question is, how long can this attrition continue before it plunges not only Ukraine, but the entire continent into the abyss? And more importantly, who dares to take the first step towards peace? Peace now, or total collapse of Europe? Every sober analysis of the Ukraine war ends with this question. Because what we are experiencing today is more than a regional conflict. It is a battle for the future of an entire continent, and the costs are borne not only by the soldiers on the front lines, but by millions of citizens in Moscow, Berlin, Paris, and Kiev. The images from Bukovsk, Kupiansk, and Kherson show a cruel reality. House-to-house fighting without rules, soldiers in civilian clothes, children who are pulled injured from the rubble. The Geneva Convention, which should actually guarantee the minimum level of humanity, seems buried in the ruins. Western media report loudly about Russian war crimes, but they conceal that the Ukrainian side is also crossing the line. The narrative is clear. Russia is the eternal aggressor, Ukraine the flawless victim. But this black and white narrative collapses as soon as you take a closer look. At the same time, the political front is intensifying. The EU wants to use Putin's frozen billions for loans to Kiev, a step that Moscow calls theft and answers with retaliation. Trump in the USA signals that he does not support the endless support, while King Charles warns, "We have to save Ukraine, and Europe is divided. America wavers, and Russia sticks to its line." Persevere, put pressure, wear down the opponent in order to ultimately enforce peace on its own terms. And here lies the bitter truth. The longer this war lasts, the less it is about Ukraine, and the more about the survival of the European system. Energy crisis, inflation, political discord, all of these are consequences that citizens feel directly. Anyone who opens the electricity bill today sees the rising food prices or fills up the tank is already paying for this war. The question that remains is not a military one, but an existential one. Does Europe want to continue to remain in a conflict that divides its own societies? Or does it dare to take the step towards real negotiations? Peace would be possible if the political will were there. But as long as the Western narrative of war until victory dominates, the outlook remains bleak. The decision lies not only with Putin or Selenskyj, not only with Trump or Charles, it lies with all of us. Peace now, or the fall into an abyss from which there is no turning back.